Welcome to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox, and together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course. Welcome to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, a podcast not about why neurotypicals don't juggle chainsaws, but someone has sent me an in-depth article just now about the first chainsaw juggler, but we're not going to go there, fascinating as that will be, because we have two absolutely crucial guests on mine and Nick's podcast. This is the second half of our monotropism, monotropic spirals and meerkatting and all sorts exploration. We've got Tanya Adkin and David Gray-Hammond. We're beginning with atypical burnout. So that's hugely fascinating to my life is punctuated by burnouts, as is many of our neurodivergent lives. So what have you found?
David, I'll leave this to you.
So atypical burnout, I always have a giggle about this because it's really misleadingly named, because it is not atypical at all. Like, what the reason that Tanya calls it atypical burnout, the reason I call it atypical burnout is because it's burnout that does not follow that typical understanding of burnout. It doesn't mean it's rare, and in fact I probably see these forms of burnout more often than I do the sort of stereotype of the autistic person shut in a dark room in bed refusing to do anything, because that's a stereotype and it's not actually how burnout works. Because, well, for a lot of us, we are adults with lives. There are demands in those lives that cannot be put off. So atypical burnout is really where we start looking at forms of burnout that tend to be mistaken or involved in more complicated mental health outcomes, is what I would say. Tanya, do you want to add anything in here?
Yeah, because I'm kind of a little bit of a cheeky inverted snob type person. The name atypical burnout was a bit of a middle finger to the literature that's out there at the minute, of where this understanding that burnout looks at depression. So atypical burnout for me is, and I think I was saying this before, that a lot of the research and the literature around burnout that's coming out now tends to just be an echo chamber of each other. We're not actually associating it with the other autistic knowledge. It's like some people have gone, oh, look, the community have created this thing years ago. We should do research about this and make it official and make it a thing, which I hate. Because it's not, it's like, the moon, the world has always been round, but we just didn't know it, So it's always been there. But atypical burnout for me is, okay, so we know burnout's a thing. When we add in other layers, because we're always going back to autism plus environment equals outcome, golden equation is central to everything. When we add in monotropism, when we add in, sensory differences, when we add in trauma, when we add in co-occurring mental health difficulties or co-occurring ADHD and blah, 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 not every experience of burnout looks like depression, looks like shutdown. It doesn't. It looks like meerkat mode. It looks like not being able to stop. It's created by monotropic split. It looks like hyperarousal. It looks like not being safe. And from that, really, it was really important for me to kind of honor those other autistic experiences, because there's a lot of people, especially ADHDers, that can't do the stopping, or don't, all of a sudden take to the bed for 5 days or a month or whatever it is. Yeah. And I felt like that representation was being missed, and it wasn't what I was seeing in my work or what my experience was. So I felt like it was really important to go, hang on a minute, pal, this ain't right. When we're talking about burnout, I think the burnout literature is trying to define what burnout is by creating an observational model, and observational models really, really bake my beans, because actually what can happen, the intersection of autistic person plus environment, those outcomes are infinite depending on any number of factors. So let's stop trying to define autistic burnout, right? And let's just say autistic burnout is basically, you know, when an autistic person has demands that outweigh their capabilities. We're trying, you know, the literature is trying to create all these tick boxes so that rich white man can sit there and go, oh yeah, well, it's definitely not burnout because you haven't ticked this one box here, you know? And that is such a disservice to the autistic community. So for me, they've co-opted autistic burnout, right? But then they're trying, which is basically built from a community, from the neurodiversity movement, from that social justice, non-pathologizing lens to say, hey, this is what's happening. This is monotropic split. There are too many demands. This is affecting me as an autistic person. And they've just then tried to shove it into a tick box observational, almost medicalized model. So for me, and this is where you can see the PDA, the big middle finger for me is, oh, I'm going to call this atypical burnout, because actually every single autistic person experiences more demands than they can cope with at some time. And we shouldn't be focusing on how that manifests, because that's entirely dependent on their environment, right? We should be acknowledging that. And
privilege and choice. You know, you mentioned, you know, children earlier. Like if your child is in crisis, you know, you have a more limited amount of choice over like what you have to take on. You know, when Kate was talking on the last podcast about sort of being at work and talking about soil, when you were at work, you have a more limited amount of choice. You can't particularly decide to disassociate. You know, you are at work. And I think there's sort of exactly that idea that you burn out, you take to your bed and you disappear off. Not all of us can even do that.
We make it nice for the neurotypicals because we just disappear, don't we? But I think it just really annoys me, actually. Sorry, can you tell? But yeah, and there's just so many ways that a person can burn out. So I don't think that we should be telling autistic people that you can only burn out in this way, otherwise your experience is not valid as an autistic person, right? That really...
You're doing autism wrong.
Yeah. And
we're always doing autism wrong, Kaya,
no autistic person can be doing autism wrong. And, you know, me and Kieran have spoke about, you know, concept of unmasking and all that pressure that we have to do autism right, you know, and I think that's why it's a really important thing to go, hang on a minute, you don't speak for me in this literature. And I understand where that comes from, where we're trying to tick box and we're trying to do this and we're trying to get the neurotypicals to validate our experiences and listen to us. But actually, we need to do that by not othering all the experiences of the autistic people that don't have the privilege to be able to stop. So that for me is where it comes.
Context.
And also,
if I put this in context,
sorry, I was just going to say.
I was just going to say
the misdiagnosis of mental health, especially towards women that come off the back of atypical burnout. I see that a lot. I see that weaponized in family court situations and social care situations, where people are wrongly given diagnosis of bipolar or borderline personality disorder and all of those things, which is then levied against them. So it sounds like a real simple thing to go atypical burnout, but there's a lot more in that thought process for me in that name. So yeah, for me, it was validating every experience when your resources are spent.
David.
I wanted to give some context on just how not rare atypical burnout is. So for me, like, I'm autistic, ADHD, and I'm schizophrenic. When I burn out, it does not look like I'm exhausted. I am exhausted, but I cannot stop. If I have a severe burnout, I will appear manic, I will appear psychotic, I will experience hallucinations and delusions as part of my schizophrenia, because it all comes together. To give you an idea of just how common that could be in the autistic community, research I've seen suggests that up to 34% of autistic people also meet the criteria for schizophrenia. So, you know, we're talking about potentially a third of the community who might who have a propensity towards psychotic experiences of burnout. And so atypical burnout is creating a space where we can talk about the fact that for some of us, we're almost going to look overactive during burnout because we're going to be caught in spirals of paranoid thoughts and you know, strange beliefs about the world, and perhaps having hallucinations even, you know. And I know certainly this concept, when I've talked about it, for example, I made a video on TikTok that got like 250,000 views, which I was not expecting.
I love your TikTok.
Yeah, thank you. But the other thing was that Tanya and I, we wrote about this. We took atypical burnout further, and we wrote about in the Creating Autistic Suffering series, the ADHD burnout to psychosis cycle, because something we see a lot in ADHD, so that autistic and ADHD people co-occurring, something we see a lot is these people who burn out end up in front of a psychiatrist to go, well, this kind of looks like psychosis, so we'll throw medication at it, and then we'll wonder why we're not seeing any positive results. And what Tanya and I realized, I think, was that there was this link between the monotropic process into atypical burnout, getting caught in what I will let Tanya define in a minute as a spiral, and then experiencing what is ostensibly psychosis. And so it became about letting people understand the mechanism by which they were getting to where they were, so that, as I mentioned before, they can work on the environment to try and reduce that. But I think really, before we go any further, I should throw back to Tanya to talk about monotropic spiral.
I'm just going to put something slightly in before we let Tanya go again. I just wanted to share how important that is, because it is so important that autistic people stay out of inpatient units, and it is so important that we are not over medicated, and it is so important that we are not wrongly medicated. And the only way that we can really start with that is a level of self-understanding, because we know the movement, you know, in the NHS and within the medical model is glacial. So it's so important to have that self-understanding for your self-preservation before somebody comes and does the observational model on you. Okay, Tanya, talk to me about monotropic spirals.
Yeah, and just to come off the back of what you were saying, Nick, like a lot of mine and David's work and personal experience and family experience has been of undiagnosed autistic people being sectioned, has been, you know, let's keep the crazy people away, let's lock them away, you know. And those environments, when autistic people go into those environments, they're
significantly traumatized. Yeah,
they are significantly traumatized, and that goes, you know, you can't unqueer a queer neurology, you can just make it more queer. You know, back to what Nick Walker says around neuroqueering. And so, and let's be honest, the medical model is not going to fix anything for us. It's not. So we're on our own, kids. And that's where, you know, it's important for me to go, hey, we're seeing these things. Your experiences of burnout are valid. And you know what? It doesn't always, and it's not either or. So I just wanted to like make that level. What we're doing, like I said before, is there are infinite number of outcomes for autistic people in burnout, right? We're just talking about, I mean, if I had time to write every day, I would do it. I don't. There is so much more to be said. But when we talk about monotropic spiral, that's just one of the things that we see.
We hope you're enjoying our discussions. If you would like to show your support, you can pop over to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws.co.uk and leave us a little tip through the PayPal link, and that helps us to continue to bring you great content.
So monotropic spiral really is a type of hyperfocus, but it's not necessarily a positive one. So we would probably look at this as rumination or looping thoughts or whatever. But actually, when we throw a monotropic donk on it, so to speak, it elevates that to a new level of understanding of how, you know, Because for me, when somebody said, oh, you're ruminating, oh, you're just not, you need to stop overthinking, you need to do that. So actually throwing that monotropism on it gets rid of that neuronormativity when we're looking at our own mental health, because it's in our environment, we're soaked in it, right? So a monotropic spiral, for me, we've got to understand that a monotropic person has got limited finite resources. So if we have something that is on our mind, what we're going to do naturally is hyperfocus on that, because we need to process it away. We need to finish that thought before we can create space, which allows us to regulate our emotions, our sensory systems, all of that stuff, just by being monotropic. But the problem is when something is on your mind so much, we need to fix it to get rid of it. And that can quite often be negative. And it can quite often lead, because we're associative thinkers, into almost like this black hole of associative thinking that confirms everything that we thought about ourselves necessarily, or every paranoid delusion, all of that stuff. And because we don't feel safe, because we're not really sure about the world around us, that makes it worse, because actually what have we been taught? We aren't safe. So actually what we find is a lot of these spirals are coming from a real basis in reality, you know. These things are true for autistic people. It's a bit like when they talk about rejection sensitive dysphoria. Dysphoria to me suggests like it's something that's completely out there and off the wall and wild, but actually we are rejected, you know. So it starts with something that is very, very grounded and based in reality, and then it just spirals, that hyperfocus spirals, and it pulls in every little bit of associative thinking into this massive black hole, which just absorbs everything. And we're on this kind of monotropic hyperfocus state, because monotropism, it's not a positive theory, it's just an explanation that can also have negative potential as well, especially when we're not safe in the environment. But your brain needs to put you in there to keep you safe. You need to be in a flow state to recharge, to rest, to process. But sometimes it doesn't work out like that. Sometimes it goes a bit wrong. And that's where things like the burnout to psychosis style kind of comes in. But once you understand the monotropism around it, and you may be able to then spot what is happening, or for example, I mean, a lot of it, and I'm sure that David won't mind me talking about this, came from the fact that I'm one of David's like safe people. So when he's experiencing burnout, or he's starting to kind of, how would you explain that, David?
I mean, a psychiatrist would say it's when I'm prodromal, you know, that period leading up to an episode. But for me, it's when I'm being drawn into that spiral that is dragging me towards a spiral. You know, I have certain safe people who I turn to support my journey through that.
Yeah, or recognize before you do. And actually, it was really important for me to kind of explain with my friend, this is what that pre-psychosis is like for you. And for you, it leads to psychosis, right? But for a lot of people, that spiral may be against a person, say, for example. So it could lead to, I don't know, criminal behavior, or it could be, you know, it's not psychosis. A monotropic spiral is not psychosis. It's extreme hyperfocus that may not be always rightly judged, if that makes sense. And it may push you to behave in ways that you might not have previously.
Something that I think is really important to note here as well, because I see this a lot in the work I've done, is that on top of this sort of black hole of focus that's pulling everything in, you're burnt out. So you're experiencing a level of skills regression. You know, you might find it difficult to communicate what's going on in your head. You're definitely going to find it harder to mask, you know, and you can start to see if you've got this skills regression coupled with this intense hyper focus on something very negative, perhaps even persecutory, you can start to understand why psychiatrists are there going, is it psychosis? Is it something really scary? And actually it's like, well, no, a lot of this could be handled by, you know, environmental changes.
Yeah.
And then what would you, just for anyone listening, going, flipping heck, something, it sounds like something that happens to me or people around me. what, in summary, although I'm aware this is probably another podcast, what are, apart from connecting with a safe person, are other good things for somebody to do when they're mid-spiral or pre-spiral?
So it's recognizing first. It's recognizing that that is where this is going, that it's recognizing and having that language to go, oh, damn, I think I might be spiraling because I've not eaten anything for the past 5 hours, or I didn't recognize. So, for example, interoception is usually one of the first things that falls off of the end of the attentional resource, if you like, because that needs to be an unconscious attentional resource. So if you are spotting those changes in yourself and you are spending far too much time on something that is not regulating you and is pushing you further into meerkat mode, you might be spiraling. If your shoulders around your ears for an extended amount of time, hyper-focusing on something in a very grasping, manicky, meerkat-y way, you might be starting to spiral. So I think for me, it's having the language to recognize and to make other people around you to recognize that that might be happening. So fundamentally, it's all the things that we would say for burnout, right? So it can be really important. And we do have a lot of writing to do about this because we've been asked this a lot, and it will be another podcast because we have a whole concept coming, which much to David's disgust, he's not allowed to talk about yet. But it's there. We have it there. We can gently orient from that spiral. We can use language to build interoception. But you can't do it on your own. You can't get yourself out of there.
I'm just going to strongly pause you because we've said interoception a lot while assuming that everyone knows what it means. A lot of our listeners will not know what it means. Can you give us a quick interoception?
Yeah, so interoception, quite literally, is internal sense. So it can be anything from like temperature, hunger, thirst, but also a subset of interoception is emotion. So alexithymia. A lot of autistic people have difficulty recognizing their own emotions or labeling them, or we might have delayed processing for whatever reason. Now, we grow up in worlds where we're constantly invalidated and taught that our internal sensations are either not important, not valid, or inaccurate. So we have an awful lot of interoceptive differences. And all of our senses require, and this is why kids have sensory diets, activity to regulate, right? So if we're continually, the world is teaching us, and trauma also creates a lot of interoceptive differences and alexithymia. If the world is constantly teaching us that our internal gut feelings are not valid, we will ignore those. But then when we're spiraling or when we're focused on other things, because we've only got that finite attentional resource, focusing on our interoception kind of falls off the end in a way. So we may become more sensory. We may be hyper-focused on something, but actually this is not helping. It's not rejuvenating me. It's not making me feel better,
Actually, I was going to say alexithymia is also part of the reason why when you're stuck in these spirals, you need other people to help you to get out of them. Because if you cannot sense how you feel about something, you cannot know what feels safe and what doesn't. So you need that other person to kind of share their emotional regulation with you, that you have that co-regulation.
Yeah, and that's why it's important that this sort of stuff is shared community experience, So when we write about this stuff, we're not going, okay, this is how this thing is and blah, 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 blah. It's more in a way to like encourage that open conversation, because a lot of autistic people, having been like othered most of their life, will go, oh, right, that's burnout. That doesn't fit with me. That's not my experience. I mean, or psychosis, for example. So many autistic people have come forward saying, oh, I experienced this, but it wasn't quite that. And this is what this is. And I mean, because it blew up over TikTok, it was crazy. But we don't actually see a lot of autistic people speaking about psychosis or speaking about that spiral or that kind of, because there's a lot of shame around it maybe, or maybe it's like, oh, that's not in the autistic camp. There must be something extra wrong with me, So for me, it's a vehicle to just like start that conversation about different intersecting experiences as well.
I think it's still very stigmatized, isn't it?
Like, it really is.
We're meant to be adulting, and we're meant to be adulting to a certain standard at all times. And
Yeah.
actually, realistically, that's not our lived experience. And I do think a lot of us in the community are very open about being autistic. We're very open about many aspects of our lives. But I think quite a lot of us, and myself included, keep the things that make me feel vulnerable in a very small circle. And things like, you know, split and spiral and burnout are still something that I keep quite, like, I probably could count them on my hand how many people who really know if that ever happens to me. And it is about those safe people, and it is about people who are willing to notice and call out your behavior, because often, sometimes, you know, you're talking about that meerkatting and it's not always pretty. Do you know what I mean? It's not always
It never
great.
is. And that's, yeah. And that's,
and it has to be safe people.
it has to be other people. I mean, it wasn't you that got yourself there. There's a lot of shame around that. But let's remember what that is. You aren't, you know, we're constantly being trying to wedged into neurotypical boxes, and then we feel shame and blame because we don't have those experiences that are on the tin, you know, that people know about, that are validated by medical communities and things. So we don't talk about them. And I think that's really important for me, you know, and it's really important for other people as well to have that kind of recognition of representation for something that might not be typical. So yeah, that's monotropic spiral and atypical burnout. That's where that came from. But you can't orient yourself out of that. The only thing that you can really do is have that knowledge base to use different markers for your regulation, really.
I would want to say in our final 3 minutes, it does strike a pang of fear in my heart. You need someone else. Well, that's all right, unless you're a single woman who lives in a flat on your own and got through burnout entirely on your own and doesn't really have any family. But anyway, that's why I'm a poet, I think. I have been able to deal with some of this stuff with my tribe of fellow poets, and by creating and by ploughing hyperfocus into poetic communities and my job. But I usually have not had the language for this. Most people still do not have this language, which is why what we're doing here is really vital. I'm just wanting to suggest that we maybe, it seems that these spirals can also lead, as you said, there are infinite outcomes. Sounds like for both you and David, Tanya, spiral situations have led you into this position where you're sharing this vital community knowledge. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason, so a lot of people either know me as the HCP lady, as the social care lady, as the, you know, the soon to be drug and alcohol research lady, all sorts of things that I've had to spiral on because of my own issues, really. And things, because like most traumatized autistic people, I'm only intrinsically motivated by things that really impact people. So yeah, and we have experienced these things. We've experienced these, you know, we're not sitting here, like, obviously a lot of that, it is in work, but fundamentally on an understanding level, it's lived experience of all of these things, of children that are traumatized through the schooling system, of social care involvement, not understanding autistic experience, of mental health services for David, you know, for me through family members. So, you know, we don't come from it without a degree of lived experience to understand what we're talking about, really.
This joke that I ended up here by accident because, you know, I went through close on a decade of drug and alcohol addiction. Throughout that time, I had undiagnosed, unmedicated schizophrenia. And it was coming out the other side of all of that kind of, you know, I looked around and went, no one's talking about these experiences. And I started talking about them just in a blog online, thinking no one would ever read it. And cut to now, as Tanya said, our Creating Autistic Suffering series has been viewed over 50,000 times. My website gets viewed like 150 to 200,000 times a year. You
It's
know,
all an accident.
I'm
Complete
working in
happy
this
accident.
field. Yeah, I'm working in this field in multiple capacities. I'm doing academic research, I'm writing books, I'm mentoring, I'm doing advocacy work. And sometimes it's kind of like, I'm really glad that people really resonate with the stuff that's out there, but in a way where I'm kind of like, I'm sorry that they resonate with it because I know what it's like. But sometimes I look around and I'm like, I think I got here by accident.
Oh, totally, 100%. Like I about 7 years ago, I did the cliche thing of leaving an abusive relationship with two disabled children in a banger of a car with whatever stuff I could get in the back of it. And being a disabled person who was experiencing atypical burnout off the back of a shitty relationship, and in this awful council house that they popped me in with nothing. And I had to learn to help me and my children recover. So I had to learn social care, I had to learn EHCPs. And then I was like, oh shit, I better do the qualification. And I just ended up creating this life for myself and my children that is entirely monotropic. So a lot like David said, I'm a social care professional. I'm just finishing off a master's. I haven't even got a bloody GCSE, happy accident. They were just said, do you want to do this master's? I'm like, yeah, why not?
I don't think you give yourselves enough credit. I think you're
it's
both
an accident,
amazing.
honestly.
And I do not think this will be the last time we talk to you by any stretch of the imagination. And I can't thank you enough for the sharing that you've just done with us and our audience. And we really appreciate you. Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.